Kia ora everyone, it's Hannah here, and welcome to another episode of Seeing Me on the Screen. Today's guest is Rachel Bechtel. She is a disability justice advocate and activist, and is currently a public service scholar at American University, Washington College of Law. She was a Fulbright UK University of Kent scholar, and has completed her Masters by Research degree about intellectual and developmental disabilities. Let's get into the discussion.
So, kia ora, Rachel. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to come chat with us. We're going to have some vibes.
Yeah.
So your current research explores the effect of contact on perceptions regarding individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Could you share some pivotal findings and the implications for media representation in particular?
Yeah, definitely. So this was research I wrapped up in about September. So the overall premise is in the context of just like ongoing deinstitutionalization. I was really intrigued with how has just a lower level of segregation affected societal prejudice towards folks with intellectual disabilities. Just we're having more like casual interactions and also more relationships between people with and without intellectual disabilities. So just looking at prejudice levels. So the main theoretical framework is called contact theory. It's very nuanced and complex. The contact theory is very old and very simple, and a lot more research has been done that shows that it's a lot more complex than we thought, which makes sense, but I'll keep it simple for now. The idea is really just the more contact you have with people outside of your group that are members of a different social group, the less prejudice you have towards that social group. Doing my research, most of my hypotheses, everything just worked out the way I expected to, mostly as far as the more positive contacts people had with folks with intellectual disabilities, the more positive their views of intellectual disabilities were. So that all made sense. But then the really surprising and depressing finding I had was in relation to caregivers. So I was really looking at the different effects of varying types of relationships. So if you were like a friend, a family member, a caregiver, or just like a member of the general public. And with the caregivers, here you have this group that has so much contact with people with intellectual disabilities, 40 hours a week or something like that, and had worse perceptions than even the general public. And so that really defied contact theory. And I think it's really just consistent with other research that is it can't just be contact, it also has to be high quality contact and contact that portrays people in an equal power relationship. And I think that really relates to media portrayals and representation, that it's not just about representation existing, it's about it being accurate and authentic. So I think that was like the big picture takeaway from my actual results. But then from my literature review and reading more about research, something that was really interesting that I didn't quite dive down the rabbit hole, but I think it really connects to your work is it's this idea of vicarious contact. So instead of having like a direct relationship with someone with an intellectual disability, it's like a friend of a friend. And the idea is that sometimes those relationships can actually be better for prejudice reduction because there's no anxiety involved. There's a lot of research that shows that when you're interacting with people outside of your group, there's this level of anxiety of can portray yourself the way you want to. How's it going to go? Are there things you don't know? And by making it vicarious, so you're not actually directly interacting, and that anxiety is cut out. And so it can be more beneficial. And I think there probably is some research about this, or is at least starting to. But with media, I just see that as being a way that you can have all of this really positive contact without that anxiety. And so it could be really beneficial for prejudice reduction. So I'm really looking forward to hopefully there being more research done in that. And just, I think another exciting part of that is cutting out some of the emotional labor that disabled folks have to do for some of their non-disabled friends. If we can have really accurate and authentic representation, that could do some of the legwork for people to educate themselves. So I'm really, just excited for future research.
But you don't look autistic, and I'm like, we're doing this again.
No kidding, just the cycle.
Yeah. It's cyclical in nature. It's just like the second, or with the amount of times my friends will reach out to me being like, do you have any diagnostic material? And I'm like, cool, I'll send it to you. But is there ethical implications involved in that? Like,
Yeah.
it's a whole other thing, and I wouldn't be asked that outright if I wasn't so explicit. It's a catch-22 of telling people. Then the risk of the additional work. It's not work per se because they're my friends, but there's still that mental toll. I think that it's very frustrating, but I still wouldn't change it for the world. Like I'd still be like, here's a bunch of stuff. You want a cool musical? Because I'll send you a cool musical along with the diagnostic information. Because if I had a nickel for every time one of my friends loved musicals but was also autistic, I have 2 nickels for just in love. That's where that's happened twice.
Your research. Your
Yeah,
collect
yeah. It's like a notes app in my phone equivalent of being like Control C, Control V at this point. That's so bad. But it's like the way I have to put those boundaries up in the first place to help people, but also make sure that I'm not overstepping any logistical barriers when it comes to talking about disability. So that's my 2 cents. But it's very interesting. I really, especially when you're like friend of a friend, I was like, the amount of times that it's happened.
Yeah, I think those relationships feel very far removed to me. And so I
Mm,
think it's interesting thinking that according to this quantitative data, which of course is limited, but this idea that just knowing that your friend has a friend with an intellectual disability is really positive for your own attitudes. It's really interesting with the disclaimer that disabled folks do not exist as a means to an end to
yeah.
reduce other people's prejudice.
So your work at Large Portland involved direct support and advocacy for adults with intellectual disabilities. So how have these hands-on experiences influenced your perspectives on media portrayal of disability?
Yeah. I was thinking about this question a lot. I don't think it really changed my perceptions of like individual people because I got into L'Arche, which also L'Arche is a cooperative living community for folks with or without intellectual disabilities. So you're like housemates, but you're also supporting each other. And there are lots of great things about that and also hard things about that on an interpersonal and a structural level. But I don't I got into that role really because I knew I had already started into my, like, disability justice journey and had been doing a lot of advocacy and just hit a point of I'm telling people how to navigate these systems that I have never personally experienced. And so I was really just looking for the opportunity to put myself in that space and also just build relationships. So it wasn't my kind of, like, entrance into the disability justice world, so I think I had already seen oftentimes media portrayals are really inaccurate, oftentimes that's really harmful, but what I did change perceptions of for me was, I think, just, like, care relationships, what it really means to be reliant on someone to get out of bed or to use the restroom and the power dynamics in those relationships. And then also just like the system as a whole. I think there's this media narrative that we used to lock people up in these terrible institutions or these like big buildings on a hill and terrible things happened. But now we're all good and we figured it out and we do it correctly. And I just found that so untrue. Like I definitely have to give credit where credit is due. We've definitely improved. Abuses are less common, but so many of these in the US, we call them group home contexts, are really just mini institutions where people still don't have real agency in big life decisions, but also little life decisions about when they go to bed, what they eat, and how get around town and whether they work. It's still really pathologized. So I think it just brought me back down to reality of deinstitutionalization is an ongoing process and we are so far from getting there. Yeah, it was a helpful perspective.
It truly is the equivalent of being on a giant treadmill, and the speed just gradually increases. The more work that's done, the more you have to keep pushing for it, and it never ends. So, how can media outlets better leverage academic insights like yours to foster more accurate and inclusive representation in media?
Yeah, I think so. Something my research showed with caregivers, like how I talked about before, is negative context that I would say in the context of caregivers comes from a really messed up system. It actually has like detrimental effects on perceptions and prejudice, even leading to like violent attitudes, which is really terrifying. And so I would hope people would look at my research and really just understand like the depth of the responsibility you have in portraying disabled characters. That not only is representation really important, but accurate representation is really important and has real implications in how people are treated in interpersonal relationships and employment relationships. And so I hope that they would see my research and be like, this is a big deal, and then go hire someone with lived experience, a disabled professional, to come in and be there from the start with character development to make sure that this portrayal is accurate and authentic. I don't think, especially in the intellectual disability space, that's not my lived experience. And so I don't have anything to offer as far as like content of portrayal. But I just hope people can see the numbers from my research and just feel what a responsibility they have and also what an opportunity they have to do it well. No worries.
So we can talk about your fun exchange as a Fulbright scholar. That'll be fun. Yeah. As a amazing Fulbright postgraduate scholar at the University of Kent, you focused on researching the impact of contact on perceptions toward individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So how has the Fulbright scholarship, your overseas study, in particular, coupled with your academic achievement at the University of Kent, enriched or evolved your advocacy efforts for disabled people?
Yeah. So for anyone that doesn't know, Fulbright is an exchange where people like study or do research or teach, and people, Americans, go to many places in the world, and then people from all over the world come to the US.
Yeah, like a weird tag team kind of situation for people that don't know.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And so I've gone to England and had the opportunity to do this research for the year. And I was very, well, first of all, so I was living in a large community. And then when I moved to England, I actually began living in another large community in the UK, which was this interesting kind of like direct comparison. That was short lived. I was only there for a month. And then I was in England for a year. So you can take my experience for what it is, pretty limited. But I was really interested, especially in that supported living situation, to see how it would change in the context of socialized healthcare. In the US, for example, attention people experience a lot is that in order to keep benefits and keep healthcare, most disabled folks can only have assets up to $2,000, which is wild. That might cover rent and some food. So it's just very minimal. And so there's always this fear and really managing assets where you can't really change your social position, but you have to keep your benefits. And so without that pressure, I was intrigued to see how it would change. And I mean, in the UK, I definitely saw the benefits of socialized healthcare. People weren't having to make life decisions based off of their healthcare. But still, a lot of those limits for folks with intellectual disabilities seem to be pretty much the same. Like some folks I lived with would work like a couple days a week at like a woodworking workshop, and they were paid like maybe a couple pounds a week. And the justification was that if they were paid more, that would jeopardize their benefits. And so I think it was really interesting to me to be like, I thought socialized healthcare would change all of these things, but yet so many of the traps remained the same. And also doing this research within the context of the UK, where this education system is still very segregated, was really interesting. I think as far as overall contact with people with intellectual disabilities, it's still just more segregated than the US is, for better, for worse. Segregation is bad, but the US also doesn't do it. So that was just an interesting tweak to the research. I would love to do a comparative study. But I also had the opportunity to work with a lot of academics, like just around the UK and at different schools doing disability research. And we were all hitting the same wall that there are so many systemic barriers to keep specifically folks with intellectual disabilities out of higher education, that I would say to do ethical disability research, it needs to be driven by folks with lived experience. But you have all of these systems keeping folks with lived experience out. So it was really great to be able to talk with a lot of academics that were really working with folks in the community and just trying to really figure out workarounds for these archaic systems to make sure that folks with lived experience were like directing the projects and were also paid for their knowledge and their time. So it was just exciting to be able to talk to people at the forefront of that work and really just get an international perspective on the disability justice movement as a whole. I think some of the issues and tensions we experience in the US still exist in the UK and other places around the world, but also some are very specific culturally. So it's interesting to get a feel for that.
Yeah, that's the one thing I have that I've noticed when like I'm reading stuff. I'm like, oh, it's your data set is pulled from like a tiny little country and like a tiny little country, tiny little segment. Like I can't really, my brain's about drawing wider conclusions when it comes to it's fine with the US because it's just you guys have such a big population. But if you're doing studies in New Zealand, it's we only have 5 million, so many people in the country, and only a small subset of that are disabled. And then when the funding and the waiting list, because we, despite having free healthcare in New Zealand, we still have crazy wait lists. Like
Mhm.
diagnostic, if you're not at risk of doing things or like having mental health issues, if you're looking to get a diagnosis, it takes at least 2 to 3 years. And that's even if you're a little bit shaky, like borderline, but if you're not explicitly having external mental health issues, intersectional issues, then it's 2, 3 years. And it's just like in that 2, 3 years, so much can change. You could lose your job, you could start going to university, become overstimulated and drop out. There's all these other things that can factor in that may prevent that kind of situation from happening of getting diagnostic material. It takes so long and these issues exist, but not commenting on them or refusing to take them into account because they're not quote unquote at risk is what's just wild to me. And I'm assuming it's worse in the US because we also have public and private, so we can pay, but
Okay.
it's so expensive. And not, oh my gosh, I'm gonna go and cut my finger and have to pay $500 like you do in the US, but it's still like bad, like atrocious. And if those things aren't integrated properly with people with lived experience, you don't have that background knowledge and background context. But also it's that risk of potentially that emotional labor aspect of do you bring someone on, but then those experiences that they've experienced themselves sounds like a giant cycle. Does that end up perpetuating issues further for that individual that's supposed to be consultancies?
What you mentioned earlier about so much of the diagnostic criteria is centered on men. And one of my friends at the University of Kent does work on trauma in late diagnosed autistic women. And just hearing these interviews of the men that it has affected their experiences and then their perceptions of terrible traumatic experiences occurring prior to a diagnosis, it's just, yeah, it's this terrible cycle that's really destructive.
Yeah. And there's that, I remember when I finally got a diagnosis after so many years, I felt this anger because why didn't people see it beforehand? But of course
Mhm.
they wouldn't see it beforehand because I was masking so hard that I was like driving myself into the ground. So of course they wouldn't notice. It's not their responsibility to notice. There's also no funding available for in schools to have people be on the lookout for more intersectional presentations and symptoms. So what is it?
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
All of the questioning of self-diagnoses is a really nuanced issue, but even in the US, like, paying so much. I just saw a creator post, and she was like, "Yeah, I finally was like, I think I'm autistic, and I wanna get diagnosed," and then went she was like, "And I thought it would be this really easy process," and I went in, and they were like, "Yeah, a 3-year wait list, even paying an arm and a leg," so definitely, it's a major
So
issue.
crazy. It's depressing. So many people, it's frustrating when people are like, self-diagnosis isn't valid, but you can see these things and think certain aspects about yourself. And then you can go and pay for the money, and then you may not even be diagnosed. And it's just what happens after that. There's the risk of have you like quote unquote lost money? Have you like
Yeah.
lost your time that you could be doing other things? But I feel like it's important because then at least you get closure in some capacity, whether that's positive or whether that's like relief, whether that's oh, okay, well, maybe it's not this, but then you end up getting other things. Like the amount of my friends that go and being like, I think I'm autistic, and they come up being like, ADHD. That makes so much more sense, etc. So reflecting on your diverse experiences in advocacy, research, and direct support, what are your aspirations for the future in continuing to champion for the rights and representations of disabled individuals? So both in media and in broader social contexts.
Yeah. So I'm actually currently in law school.
Woo!
And
I
yes,
also.
am halfway through my first year. And it is as hard as they say it is. But I knew law school was the plan for a while. I think we need more perspectives, and especially wanting to do something as complex as disability rights work. I just knew I didn't know enough. So I went looking for more perspectives in direct support and research and advocacy. And really, what drove me to law school is I kept hitting this wall in my advocacy. And I can tell people what the law is over and over, but without a law degree, if they don't want to change and they don't want to follow the law, I'm really powerless. So I'm excited to finally be in law school. And I'm really thankful for just having had other non law experiences to be able to bring to the table. But my goals in this phase really are that just enforcement of legislation that already exists. We definitely need more legislation, but I think about, like, for us, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is this great piece of legislation that is so often ignored and so often violated. And really, so the ADA has a lot to do with like physical accessibility and accommodations in the workplace, things like that. And when it's violated, really just let segregation run rampant, and which is really cyclical with promoting prejudice when disabled people can't get into the spaces. So wanting to work on that, but then also on guardianship issues. I think there's no other place in society where we have a doctor say that someone doesn't have capacity and then we take away all of their rights. I think that is wild, and especially when the authority is coming from a deficit-based model that's often conflating like communication styles with capacity and all of these things. It's this really rash and violent measure. So looking to get rid of as many guardianships as possible, and yeah, just see, hopefully I can marry my love for research and disability justice and really just support folks to live more self-determined lives.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this episode today, Rachel. It's been so much fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Seeing Me on the Screen. If you liked today's episode, be sure to like, share, and subscribe because the algorithm monsters need statistical sustenance. If you have any suggestions for guests or any topic ideas, make sure to reach out by sending us an email at seeingmeonthescreenpod@gmail.com or DM our Instagram page at seeingmeonthescreenpodcast.
That's the conspiracy theory that my cat's planning to overthrow the podcast because she's also disabled. Sounds so bad out of context without the prior knowledge that the cat has a missing eye.